Good afternoon. This afternoon, my guest is Dawn Chang. The subject and the reason for our program this afternoon, well, let me first tell you what the title of the program is going to be. It's going to be the traditions, customs, practices, and the law of iwi kupuna. And the reason why we have this subject today is because recently, within the past 5 to 10 years, we have found bones where construction of buildings, condominiums, and recently the rail system. And so this is a very applicable and pertinent subject. And my guest this afternoon is Dawn Chang, as I stated. And Dawn, can you first tell us your professional background and what brings you to be with us this afternoon as someone who is aware and cognizant of the iwi kupuna matter?
Okay. Thank you, Roy. Actually, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your program today. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, my background. I was a social worker with Queen Liliuokalani's Children's Center doing community organizing in Waimanalo. And then I clerked. I went to law school, Richardson School of Law, and I clerked for a couple of years with Judge Walter Heen over at the Intermediate Court of Appeals. Really appreciated that experience at the appellate court level. And then after that, I worked for the Department of Attorney General's Office, advising both Department of Transportation and Department of Land and Natural Resources. Currently, I have a small consulting firm called Ku'iwalu, and we specialize in facilitating culturally sensitive issues. So I appreciated the opportunity to come today to talk to you, and I do want to say I am not an expert on iwi kupuna. Iwi kupuna is defined as iwi is Hawaiian for bones, kupuna of our ancestors. So when you hear the term iwi kupuna, it does refer to the bones of our ancestors. And again, I'm not an expert. What you will hear is my opinion. I will share the way that I was raised, but my familiarity with the burial laws is based upon my time at the Attorney General's office.
Before we go on,
Okay.
Let me ask you, where were you raised? You were raised in Hawaii.
I was. My family is, my mother is Edna Kealoha Pau'ole Ho'okano, who is from the windward side of Oahu, the ahupua'a of Kaho'olawe. So my mother's family had kuleana lands, we still do, in Kaho'olawe. And my tutu, my mother's mother, is actually buried on our family kuleana. And we have other family members that are buried on our kuleana lands as well. My tutu, because my mother her family could afford a headstone, has a headstone. There are burials next to my tutu where there are no headstones, but we know who's buried there.
How do you know that they're there?
Because of our family. I mean, so our families continue to go up there, and my mother, we clear the grave sites. So our family knows who's buried there. So those burials would not be considered, would fall under the burial laws, because we know who's buried there. But that's my familiarity, my mother's family, Native Hawaiians, born and raised, and we continue to live on the windward side. But we have a connection to that land, and we have families that are buried on our family lands.
Dawn, let me ask you, while you were growing up, did your tutu, your mother, your relatives talk about iwi kupuna?
No, they didn't. My mother, they're Episcopalians. They belong to the Church of St. John's by the Sea. So many Hawaiians, they became the Christian faith. But I do recall my uncles talking about, as family members passed, I had two uncles. My uncle Roy Ryder, who, when someone would pass, they would have the body would be put out in the parlor, and their responsibility was to prepare the body for viewing, because in those days you didn't have a funeral parlor. Families took care of them that way. But my tutu passed away before I was born, so I didn't know my tutu. But many years later, our family members would talk about how they would care for their family members who have passed. But my mother did not talk to or train us in what we would call traditional practices of caring for iwi kupuna. Again, she was of the Episcopalian faith. They continue to be, I belong to the Episcopal Church as well. But nonetheless, many Hawaiians found ways to live in both Christian and maintain traditional Hawaiian values.
Such being a case where you were not taught by your family or friends about iwi kupuna, you said that you were with the State Attorney General's office.
Yes.
Is that where you started to learn about iwi kupuna?
Yes. I was with the Attorney General's office during this 80s, 90s, and early 2000. And if you can recall, there was a project on Maui. It was Ritz-Carlton, it's Honokohua.
I do remember, along the beach.
Along the beach.
Right.
So if you go down to Kapalua,
right,
you see the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Well, back in the early, mid-'80s, they were building the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. A part of that, they were doing an archaeological work, because the hotel was going to be right alongside the beach.
Right, correct.
As they were doing the archaeological, what we would call today an archaeological inventory survey, a subsurface excavation, they began to uncover 1 burial, 2, 5, 10, a total of about 1,100 burials were disturbed actually. There was no law.
Why do you say disturbed?
Well, they were intentionally dug up. They were not, they were discovered, but they were taken out of their natural, where they were originally buried.
All
so,
right.
And it is a matter of opinion. Some will say discovered, some will say disturbed. But for Hawaiians, during that period of time, saw that as a desecration, the disturbance of 1,100 burials, and there was no state law to protect them. So as a result of Honokohua, the Hawaiian community became enraged at the fact that there was no state law to protect that. There was no way to preserve and protect these burials that were unearthed at this proposed hotel site. So as a result of that, Act 306 was passed by the legislature in 1990, which established the state burial laws. But if you go to Honokohua today...
Excuse me.
Yes.
Was that law just to cover Hawaiian burial sites?
No.
Or all sites? Burial sites?
It was designed to address what we would call unknown, unmarked burials.
Right.
So they could be, so these are generally burials that you're going to find subsurface. It's not like it's a cemetery. It's not like you have a headstone. It's not where you are anticipating to find a burial there. Let's say you're doing, like in Honokohua, they were doing a development project, or let's say Department of Transportation is going to do a highway project, or even a residential homeowner is going to build a house, and they do some subsurface excavation, and they find a burial. So the law was designed to address how do we manage and situations where we are finding an unmarked or an unknown burial. And again, the presumption is that they're going to be Hawaiians. Because most of if you can recall, well, maybe we won't recall, but we call them pre-contact burials. So prior to pre-contact, which would be 1776, they're...
excuse me, pre-contact meaning Captain Cook.
Captain Cook, yeah.
Right.
So that's kind of a term of art we would call pre-contact.
Right.
And while there may be a dispute as exactly how many Native Hawaiians lived on the main 8 Hawaiian islands prior to contact, it's anywhere between 300,000 to 800,000. Depends upon what scholars you read, but those Hawaiians are buried someplace. So the law, while it does address all unknown, unmarked burials, there is a presumption that most of the burials that are going to be discovered are going to be Native Hawaiians.
Hawaiians, I see. Were you at the Attorney General's office when that happened, the discovery?
Yes. So
What department were you?
with advising Department of Land and Natural Resources.
Were you instrumental, or should I say, did you participate in the drafting of the legislation?
I won't say that I was instrumental, but I did participate, the Attorney General, because the burial laws, Chapter 60-43, under Hawaii Revised Statutes, falls under State Historic Preservation Laws, which is under the Department of Land and Natural Resources. So our division at the Attorney General's office would work with DLNR in drafting that legislation, Act 306, drafting the administrative rules that followed, Chapter 13-300, and then actually implementing and executing those rules. So I was very fortunate in being able to work with the department in both the administrative rulemaking process, as well as the whenever there were challenges or lawsuits to be filed, I was able to work on those cases.
Was there, under this new legislation, a commission or a board that would administer the law?
Well, the law is administered by the Department of the Department of Land and Natural Resources. However, during the establishment of Act 306, there was an interim burial council. So the way that the law is designed, there's essentially 2 types of burials that fall under the law. We call them previously identified burials. These would be burials that we would find, for example, during an archaeological inventory survey.
All right.
A decision as to what would happen to those burials, whether they get preserved in place or relocated, would fall under the authority of the Island Burial Council.
Each island has its own council.
They do, except for there's Kauai Ni'ihau,
Right.
and then there's Lanai Maui. But otherwise, Molokai has a burial council, Oahu, and then Hawaii Island.
I see.
And the law was designed to acknowledge that different geographic areas or mokus of the island may have different burial practices. So in a way to respect
That's
that.
very interesting, Don. Let me ask you this. Am I to understand then that in ancient times, each moku or island had its own burial practice?
Well, what my experience has been is that, for example, on the island of Oahu, there's a lot, Oahu, Maui, islands are older, a lot more sand. We tend to find many more unmarked burials in sandy conditions. Versus on Hawaii Island, not as much sand, not as old, we find more burials in lava tubes or caves. So there are probably fundamental burial practices that are the same, but there may be different conditions as to how people practice, what are their cultural protocols, and cultural protocols may vary by different family members as well.
All right.
So,
Don, we are going to take a short break at this time. If anyone has any question, please tweet us at ThinkTech Hawaii, and we will answer your question as best as we can. Thank you.
Okay, this is ThinkTech Hawaii, and it's Wednesday. Every Wednesday is Energy Wednesday here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy. 4 to 5 p.m. every Wednesday. Come and listen to us. And just to show you what I mean, I'm going to ask Sharon to tell us more.
come and see us every Wednesday, as Jay said. And we have people like Jim Albers from HECO here and co-host Ray Starling here every Wednesday. We not only go on Olelo and OC16, but also stream live. So please come visit us, hear about the latest in clean energy.
Okay, Jim, you've been here. You got any comment on all this?
As important as energy is in all of our lives today, this is a great forum and a great format to vet those issues. So I encourage everybody to listen in and participate.
Okay, Ray, what do you think for a close?
Well, I think this is the greatest show in the energy world here in Hawaii. You can come here every week, 1 hour, and catch the latest on what's happening and hear from the people who really know what's going on, like Jim Alberts. We appreciate your coming today.
Thank you.
Ray Starling, Sharon Moriwaki, Jim Alberts, and Jay Fidel here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy, 4 to 5
Aloha.
p.m. Wednesday. Aloha.
Don, before we went on our break, you mentioned that each island, besides the geographic makeup of each island, there were certain protocols that each family had or each island had. Now, again, explain to us what were some of these protocols? Before we go on and you answer, Don, the subject today is a very interesting subject, and many of us are not aware of the customs and practices. So whatever you explain to us is very helpful and interesting. So when you talk about protocol, I'm thinking what protocols they were.
Well, I want to be very, how do I say, honest about that. I don't profess to know what the protocols, the
Yeah.
cultural protocols of all the different families are. They will have their own practices. Some people may do prayers differently. You may have some Hawaiians who are Christians who may do a Christian prayer, other Hawaiians who may have traditional chanting. But in my experience, where we have had situations where I've had the opportunity to participate in what we would call a reburial. So for example, let's say there's been a burial discovery, we've gone through the process and now they're going to reinter or rebury the iwi kupuna.
We bury where?
Well, that's a determination made by, through the regulatory process in consultation, let's say, with families who are recognized, with the State Historic Preservation Division, and if applicable, with the Island Burial Council. But normally, reburials would be done before the sun comes up. There may be different ways upon which families would wrap the iwi kupuna before they're buried. So I don't know what all of the different protocols are.
I see.
The law is really designed to respect those families and their protocols. And so the burial laws were, it was drafted in a way that we wanted to make sure we were engaging families who had a connection, potential
I see.
connection to the burial. So the law recognizes what we would call a lineal descendant. That's someone who you actually know who's buried there. So you could be a lineal descendant to that kupuna, or you could be a cultural descendant. For example, you come from the same ahupua'a.
Oh,
I would be a lineal descendant to my tutu. I know that she's buried there, and I have a direct relationship to her. So the law really, we wanted to give deference to families who had a connection or who could establish a connection to iwi kupuna that were discovered. Because there is a very important, Hawaiians would call it kuleana, or responsibility.
right.
So when families come forward and they acknowledge that we have a relationship to these kupuna iwi, then that means that they're willing to step up and take responsibility to what we would call malama, to care
I
for.
see.
And so where we do not have families, let's say we have no idea and who these kupuna may be related to, and we don't have any families who come forward, in those cases, the Burial Council makes decisions or State Historic Preservation does. But the preference is always if we can find families
Yes.
who have a relationship, because we know that they will be cared for.
I see. Dawn, before I forget, let me just go back for a second on
Okay.
this hotel in Kauai. If I remember correctly, the site and the location of that hotel was moved
That's correct.
because of the many burial
That's correct.
that was on the beach, if I remember.
Yes, so this was actually on Maui, the Ritz-Carlton in Kapalua. While there was no state law to protect them, we did have a Native Hawaiian governor. We had
That was John Waihee.
John Waihee,
Yeah.
Governor Waihee. And the owner was sensitive, so they agreed to move the hotel back. So the next time, if anybody goes to visit the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, you will see a mound in front of the hotel, and under that mound, it's a large dirt mound. There's no, it's not a heiau. You don't find rocks, platform around it. It's just a mound, and the community was comfortable with that, what we would call a treatment, burial treatment. So all of the 1,100 burials are under there,
I see.
and the hotel moved back.
Let me ask you this then. If I were to go to the entry of this hotel, is there a plaque that says burial?
No.
Nothing?
And that was in deference to the community at that time. How did they want to acknowledge this? And again, those are decisions that we give to families. We call that a burial treatment.
I see.
And most families would prefer there not be a plaque.
I see.
You don't want, Hawaiians call it, you don't want people to be maha'oi, to be
Yeah.
nosy.
Right.
And it's really the interests of the family members. So in many cases where we do have a burial preserve area,
Right.
you don't necessarily see a plaque acknowledging that
I
there are
see.
these many burials under here. And that is intentional.
If I recall correctly again, Dawn, when Walmart was
Yes.
constructed, I believe iwi kupunas were found
That's correct.
on that location.
Yes.
What happened to those bones?
And you're right, this is the Walmart at Keomoku Street.
Right.
And in that case, they did not do an archaeological inventory survey, so they found the iwi as they were beginning to do construction. And they unearthed numerous iwi kupuna there. And there were families that were recognized as being cultural descendants to those iwi kupuna. For several years, they literally were in a trailer in the back of Walmart in their loading zone. So I had the opportunity to work with the family members to determine what would be the best treatment, because clearly having them in a container was not the best
Right.
treatment.
This is not a sign of respect, is it, to have it in?
No,
Yeah.
it's not. So
Yeah.
the families came together and agreed on a burial, what we would call like a platform. So if you
I
go
see.
behind Walmart at the corner of, I believe it's Sheridan and Makaloa,
Right.
right at that corner, you'll see a mound, a platform, a stone platform, and then you'll see native vegetation around it.
I
And
see.
under that platform
Mm-hmm.
is all of the burials that were discovered there. And so there was a ceremony that was performed by the various family members who were
Right.
recognized to have a relationship to those burials, and then they have been reinterned, and I'd like to believe that the kupuna are on their way to the next life.
I see.
So that was done, but you're right, there are several situations where we do have, burials have been discovered, and normally the preference is to, if they are taken out of the ground, it is to put them back as close as they can to where they were found.
The original
To
site.
the original site.
Don, let me, as you know, among the Japanese, the Buddhist Japanese, there's a bone season where, it's a time when the so-called spirits of the deceased come back and the descendants honor the ancestors. Do the Hawaiians have a similar ceremony where they can go to these burial sites to pray at a certain time of the year, or?
No, it's not a seasonal, it's just,
Can they do that?
that is part of the burial laws. It does recognize the rights of recognized lineal cultural descendants to have access to those reburial sites. So there are accommodations for that. So if family members do want to have access. But I think for many Hawaiians, at least for our family, there's not a particular season. You exercise your responsibility whenever you feel it appropriate. So likewise, I'm not aware of any. There may be, some family members may have their own practices, but under the rules, we do acknowledge that families that have been recognized do have the right of access.
So they can go onto the premises
Right.
and conduct
Right. We have
whatever
reasonable
services.
access. So,
Right.
right.
Dawn, growing up, I grew up on the island of Hawaii. When I was growing up, I used to hear of caretakers of burial sites. So-and-so was a famous descendant of the caretaker of this, mostly royal families.
Okay.
And I guess many families continue to have these caregivers or caretakers of burial sites.
I have heard of that too. Again, it is a very serious responsibility of kuleana that there might be some family members whose responsibility it is to care for their family members that have passed. So that may indeed be their own family cultural practice. But in the case of the burial laws, many of those burials that we have discovered or disturbed, we don't know who they are.
I see.
So these are family members who have stepped up, assumed responsibility because they may have come from that ahupua'a. They feel a responsibility, but most of the burials that would fall under the burial laws are not necessarily burials that we know exactly who they are. In many cases, the burials that were discovered are pre-contact. So these were Hawaiians who were buried prior to the Western contact. And we can tell that because these burials, what we have found is that they will be buried in a fetal position. So that's an indication that that is a pre-contact burial or one prior to especially Christian influence. So that, in those cases, gives us a good indication of the time period. If we find the burial in a fetal position, again, it usually means it's a pre-contact. Historically and traditionally, Hawaiians, unless you were of royalty or you were, because for Hawaiians, there is a belief that the mana or the power is in the iwi.
I see.
So if you acquire the bones of someone of royalty or a great chief or warrior, the belief is you would take on that mana. So my understanding is, for example, King Kamehameha I.
Right.
No one knows where his iwi are buried.
Right.
They were secreted away.
Right.
So that is, with the practice, at least as my understanding is, those who have royalty or of chiefly blood or warriors,
Right.
Their iwi would be hidden away. But most Hawaiians, the practice has been, you're going to bury where you lived. So likewise, some like my tutu, she's buried where my family's kuleana lands are. So what we're finding is that where there is evidence of habitation, a land commission award, Kuleana lands, there might be an increased possibility that there might be subsurface native Hawaiian burials there.
Dawn, we are going to take another break at this time. And to the listeners, if you have any question, please do not hesitate to call us or to tweet us at ThinkTech Hawaii. Thank you.
This is Alice Lee Hagan, host of ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show here at ThinkTech Hawaii is every Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I bring in interesting guests from Hawaii, the mainland, and hopefully international guests in the future. Do join us on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Aloha.
Aloha, I'm Kili'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right, and what's good, and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
Dawn, we are back live again. We don't have too much time left.
Okay.
So I would like to concentrate on the laws of the unmarked, unknown burials.
All right.
And maybe you can explain to us, in essence, what this law is and how it's administered, and particularly now that the rail system is going from Kaho'olawe to, I guess, Waikiki, many EVs are being found. So can you tell us, when an EV is found during this construction period, what does a family do? Or what does a person whose ancestors may be buried along the route there?
Okay. You've asked me several questions, so
All
let me
right.
try to
Sure.
do the best I can. With respect to the law, and let me specifically talk about the rail project, because
All right.
as a result of the rail project, there was a significant case that was decided by the Hawaii Supreme Court. So in 2012, the Hawaii Supreme Court rendered a decision in the case called Kalekini versus Yoshioka. And in that case, the Supreme Court held that before construction can begin, SHPD, or before SHPD, State Historic Preservation Division, can approve the project moving forward, you must complete the sequential process that's set forth under the administrative rules. That sequential process requires the identification of historic properties, mitigation. So in this case, the Supreme Court said the entire project is the entire 20-mile rail project. So the essence of the Supreme Court decision was that an archaeological inventory survey, subsurface testing, had to be completed before the State Historic Preservation Division could verify that the rules have been complied with. So essentially the project—
For the full 20—
For the full 20 miles.
All right.
So essentially at that point in time, after 2012, the rail project had stopped because they could not proceed. So so during that period of time, there was an archaeological inventory survey that was done for the entire 20 miles.
Let me stop you. Was that conducted by a private consultant firm or by the government?
No, it's, most archaeological inventory surveys are done by an archaeological firm. So
A private firm.
A private firm. Government, this is such a large-scale project. So
Yes.
there was an archaeological consultant, and the rail project, another unique aspect of the rail project is that there was a request by the Hawaiian community and family members who had concerns about potential number of iwi kupuna that could be found. There was also the use of cultural monitors. So cultural monitors, these were people who may have had a connection with the area, who may be cultural practitioners, but these are people who stepped forward and said they want to work alongside the archaeological monitor and be able to address any potential iwi discovery. So we had cultural monitors, archaeological
Excuse me
monitors.
again.
Yeah.
Those cultural monitors, in the law, we talk about standing. Do they have the right to participate?
Okay, there is no legal requirement for a cultural monitor. So a cultural monitor is very different from a recognized cultural descendant.
All right.
A cultural monitor is someone who, it's more of a, their role is to monitor the project. So for example, an archaeological monitor they'll do a test trench, they'll dig
All
up,
right.
and let's say they will screen whatever they find in that trench. The archaeological monitor and the cultural monitor will look at whatever's been unearthed.
All right.
And at that point in time, they're looking, is there historic properties that are found? Are there iwi kupuna? So a cultural monitor is not the same, may not be the same as a recognized cultural descendant. So under the law recognizes cultural and lineal descendants. And they have a right to make recommendations as to whether a burial should be preserved or relocated. They have the right to be consulted on what's the appropriate treatment.
Right.
So that is a very different role than a cultural monitor. So under the HEART project, and there is a perception in this community that a lot of burials have been discovered in the rail project. I think a lot of people thought that just knowing how sensitive Kaho'olawe is,
Right.
that we would find many, many burials. And
What is the reality?
so the reality is that out of the 20-mile rail project, they have discovered approximately 13. And not all are what we would call a full skeletal remain or an in situ burial. Some of these are bone fragments, some are partial burials, but they are all given the same recognition
I see.
as a burial. So I am in no way diminishing that number, but it is not, I think, what some people thought there would be many more. But one burial is more than enough.
Right,
There was never
right.
an intention to disturb a burial, but there is a process, so like, as you asked, so what happens if a burial is discovered? So in the case when the archaeological inventory survey occurred, the monitors would stop all that work in that area. There would be, if there were cultural protocols, they would do them at the time of the discovery. Then there was, the whatever iwi was discovered would be put back into the trench.
I see.
And they would be,
With the approval of the family? They
well,
said-
at that point in time, there's been no families that have been recognized. The process
Oh,
just
I see.
begins.
All right.
So first there's an archaeological inventory survey. Let's identify historic resources, including burials that may be found. Then we went through the process of then going, doing a public notice, any family members that may have a connection. We had numerous families coming forward to be recognized as cultural descendants.
I see.
So Oahu Island Burial Council recognized these
What
families.
council is that?
Oahu Island Burial Council. They recognize these family members. And so as part of, as you asked, what is their standing, what's their rights? So as a recognized cultural descendant, the HEART Project consults with them. There's regular meetings with the families to update them on the project, to update them on any burials that have been discovered in addition, let's say during, we call it data recovery. And the families will make recommendations as to what should happen. So with respect to the burials that have been discovered to date, the recommendation and HARD has agreed to preserve those burials in place.
In place.
So that would mean that, so they would go back into the trench and they would be preserved there. There will be treatments for all of those burial, whether they're bone fragment or a full burial.
So am I to understand, Dawn, that if they're reburied at the same site, that the rail system may be going above the burial site?
That's correct. So there will be protective measures. So for example, there may be a steel plate put over them. There may be markers put over them so that in the future, because many of these burials may have been found like in a roadway where the rail project may go over. So
the families do not object to having the rail system. If it were my family, I wouldn't be too happy, Dawn, to have the rail going over my ancestors' burial.
And that's a very good point, Roy. I think the families, you know, it's always a balance between, you know, do we move the burials? Do we preserve them? And I think the families where recommendation was to preserve the burials where they are.
I see.
The rail is an elevated project, so there will be buffers in place so that there's no, let's say you won't have a column that goes on top of the project.
I see.
You may have the rail that goes above it,
right.
but you won't have a rail column that goes actually over the burial. The HART project has redesigned some of the columns to avoid impacting the burials. So you may be right. There may be some who had some strong feelings about having, you know, this rail feature go above them.
Right.
But through discussions with the families, they, again, their recommendation was to preserve them in place. HART agreed, and then now to ensure that they won't be subject to further disturbance, there'll be measures to protect them during construction and when the rail is ultimately completed.
All right. Let me ask you one question which may not relate to this burial, but it concerns heiaus, Dawn. Are there EV kupunas in heiaus?
There may be, but normally, and again, I'm only speaking on my own experience. There will be many Hawaiians who will disagree with me, and many Hawaiians are much more knowledgeable than me on this. I'm just not aware of any iwi kupuna that may be buried in a heiau.
Yeah.
There may indeed be, but again, the practice has generally been maka'ainana, or commoners, would bury where they lived.
I see.
So, you know, again, you could have some Hawaiians who are of chiefly status.
Right.
You could have other, you know, Hawaiians who did bury in a heiau, but I'm not aware of any.
All right.
So it's not to say that they aren't, but I'm just not aware of any.
All right. My last question is, in balancing the iwi kupunas and modern society, it's a very sensitive thing for Native Hawaiians,
Yes.
especially at
Yes.
this time
Yes.
when there are questions of sovereignty and what do Native Hawaiians do for the future?
Yes.
So maybe we can answer that question because we don't have enough time. But let us maybe invite you back again, Dawn, and then we can elaborate on some of these more interesting subjects.
And more than willing to come back. But I do want to make a comment about
All right.
that. I mean, I think there are many Hawaiians who believe that,
All right.
that's not.
Dawn, I would like to thank you, and I am certain that the viewers really appreciate your presence today, and I think they learned a lot.
Good.
And we would like to invite you back, and thank you very much for appearing this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yep.